There is a war happening right now. Somewhere on this planet, soldiers are dug into trenches, commanders are issuing orders, and people are dying. And yet, in just a few weeks, those same soldiers might lay down their weapons. Not because a treaty was signed, not because a general surrendered, because a soccer ball dropped in the center of a field and a referee blew a whistle. That sounds impossible. It sounds like something someone made up to feel better about the world. But it has happened, more than once. And when you understand why, you stop seeing the World Cup as a sports tournament. You start seeing it as something much older. Something your brain was built for long before nations existed. Here is what nobody tells you about the World Cup. It is not really about football. It has never been about football. Football is just the language. The real story is about what happens inside your nervous system when you feel like you belong to something larger than yourself. And that story goes back much further than 1930, when the first World Cup was played in Uruguay. It goes back to the oldest problem your species ever had to solve. Survival. Not your survival. The survival of your group. For nearly all of human history, your ancestors did not live alone. They lived in tribes. Small, tight, fiercely loyal bands of people who depended on each other to eat, to stay warm, to fight off predators. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who spent decades studying the social psychology of groups, found that humans have a deep, almost biological need to belong to a team. Not a preference, a need. When you feel that your group is threatened, your brain releases cortisol. Your heart rate climbs. Your attention narrows. You become, in a very real physiological sense, a different person than you were 5 minutes ago. Your brain does not distinguish between your tribe being threatened by a rival tribe and your national football team being threatened by a rival nation. To the ancient circuitry running in the back of your skull, it is the same event. That is not a metaphor. That is neuroscience. And that is where the wars begin to make sense. In the summer of 1969, El Salvador and Honduras were already in the middle of a political crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadoran migrants living in Honduras had been expelled from the country in a land dispute that had been building for years. There was real anger on both sides. Then the two nations were drawn into the same World Cup qualifying group. They played 3 matches. After each match, riots broke out. After the third match, El Salvador broke off diplomatic relations with Honduras. 4 days later, El Salvador invaded. The conflict lasted 100 hours. It killed roughly 2,000 people. Journalists at the time nicknamed it the Football War. Football did not cause that war. The tensions were already there, loaded and ready. But football gave those tensions a stage. It gave two nations a ritual space where the deepest tribal emotions could surface. And on that occasion, they did not stop at the boundary of the game. But here is the counterintuitive truth. Most of the time they do. The anthropologist Victor Turner spent years studying what he called liminal rituals. A liminal ritual is a ceremony that exists outside of normal life. It has its own rules, its own time, its own space. Inside a liminal ritual, normal social hierarchies collapse. The king and the farmer stand in the same field. The enemy and the neighbor watch the same sky. Turner found that these rituals are not just entertainment. They are social technology. They let communities process conflict, identity, and belonging in a controlled environment, so those forces do not explode outside of it. The World Cup is the largest liminal ritual on Earth. Every 4 years, 194 nations set aside their differences long enough to compete inside a shared set of rules. Not because they like each other. Not because politicians decided to be kind. But because there is something in the structure of fair competition that your nervous system responds to before your rational mind has time to react. Think about what happens when two rival nations play each other in a World Cup match. Not after. During. For 90 minutes. Both sides agree to be governed by the same referee. Both sides agree that the score on the board represents a truth neither side can argue with. Both sides agree that when the final whistle blows, the result is legitimate. That is an extraordinary thing to agree to. Because in real conflict, one side almost never accepts the other side's version of events. But in football, they do. For 90 minutes, they do. And sometimes, that 90 minutes becomes something more. On Christmas Day in 1914, British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches along the Western Front and played football in no man's land. This is one of the most documented events of the First World War, recorded in letters, diaries, and regimental histories. The military historian Stanley Weintraub, who spent years researching the Christmas truce, found accounts of at least a dozen informal matches played between enemy soldiers that day. These were men who had been trying to kill each other, who would be trying again to kill each other the following morning. And on that one day, they played football. Why? Not because they had forgotten the war. Not because they suddenly agreed on politics. But because football gave them a shared ritual to stand inside. A temporary space where the rules of killing were suspended and the rules of the game took over. The game did not end the war. The war resumed. But for one day, the game was stronger than the guns. That keeps happening. In 2003, the Ivory Coast was locked in a brutal civil war that had split the nation in two, the government-controlled South and the rebel-held North. The national football team, which included players from both sides of the divide, qualified for the Africa Cup of Nations. After the qualifying match, the captain Didier Drogba, standing in front of the television cameras with his teammates, addressed his nation directly. He asked both sides to lay down their weapons, to give peace 5 days. 5 days to celebrate this one moment of shared victory. And they did. There was a ceasefire. It held for long enough that peace negotiations could begin. The Civil War formally ended in 2011. One man, one moment, one football match. That is not a small thing. What is happening in those moments is something the social psychologist Henri Tajfel called social identity theory. Tajfel, who survived the Holocaust and spent the rest of his life trying to understand how ordinary people can become instruments of mass violence, found that humans define themselves primarily through the groups they belong to, not as individuals, as members. And when the group succeeds, you feel it as if you personally succeeded. Your brain releases dopamine. You stand taller. You feel pride. You feel unity. And in that moment of unity, the person standing next to you, the person you have been taught to see as other, becomes, briefly, the same as you. Because you are both members of the same group. You both belong to this nation that just scored a goal. That is why the World Cup 2026 is not just a tournament. 48 nations. 3 host countries. The United States, Canada, and Mexico. Nations that have complicated, real, sometimes painful political relationships with each other, agreeing to co-host the largest sporting event on the planet. That is a liminal ritual on a scale that has never been attempted before. And what will happen inside it is not predictable by politicians or economists. It will be determined by the ancient machinery in 2 billion human brains simultaneously recognizing a shared symbol. A ball, a goal, a flag. None of this means football is magic. It is not. It cannot stop a war that both sides have decided to fight. It cannot undo a century of injustice or a decade of famine or a political wound that has never been allowed to heal. The football war proved that. The tensions between El Salvador and Honduras existed before the matches, and they existed after. Football gave them an arena. It did not resolve them. But here is what football can do. It can create a pause, a breath, a moment in which 2 people who have been trained to see each other as enemies are instead watching the same thing at the same time and feeling the same surge of emotion. Not for each other, for the game. And in that shared attention, something shifts. Not permanently, not deeply, not always. But sometimes, just long enough. The researcher Emile Bruno at MIT's Brain and Cognitive Sciences Department spent years studying what he called modus ponens empathy, the narrow pathway through which human beings who have been taught to dehumanize another group can briefly rehumanize them. He found that shared emotional experiences, specifically ones that are intense and public and mutual, are among the only reliable ways to crack that wall. Not speeches, not statistics, not arguments. Emotion. Shared, simultaneous, intense emotion. That is what a World Cup goal is. It is a shared emotional experience so intense that it temporarily overrides the brain's tribal categorization system. For a second, you do not see a rival. You see a human being having the same feeling you just had. And that second matters. That second is what your ancestors were building toward every time they sat around the same fire, danced the same dance, told the same story. The ritual is not the point. The shared humanity inside the ritual is the point. Tonight, when a match kicks off in one of the 2026 stadiums, there will be people in the crowd who do not speak the same language, who live under governments that have accused each other of crimes, who have been taught, in school or in church or in their homes, that the person sitting 3 rows away belongs to a group that cannot be trusted. And for 90 minutes, they will watch the same ball. They will hold their breath at the same moment. They will groan at the same miss and roar at the same goal. That roar is not new. It is not modern. It is not about football. It is the oldest sound your species knows. The sound of a group recognizing itself. The sound of the fire and the dance and the story. The sound of something your ancestors discovered hundreds of thousands of years ago that is still, right now, running in the background of your nervous system, whether you want it to or not. The World Cup does not stop wars because football is powerful. It stops wars, when it does, because you were never really built for war in the first place. You were built for the fire. And sometimes, when the conditions are right and the ball hits the back of the net, the whole world remembers that at once. Just like you did the last time you watched your country play.